All right. Oops. Here we are for another live review session. This is to help you prepare for the Unit 2 exam if you're in my hybrid class or classes, and the midterm exam if you're in my Wednesday class. So, just like yesterday, and for the other reviews that are going to be happening throughout the week, any questions that you have about the material from, the material that's going to be on the exam, just let me know, and I will do my best to answer that in real time. I have my trusty marker and my whiteboard. Let me make sure I have the right marker since I keep hanging on to dead ones. That's a dead one. That's a dead one. Yeah, we're just going to throw these right away. Okay, good. So yeah, I think we are ready to go. Also, hopefully you saw my email today that the exam's online. I need to focus on what I'm actually saying rather than just talking and pretending that I know what's going to come out of my mouth. The exam is now online. So you can find it in the Unit 2 course content folder, whether you're in one of my hybrid classes or you're in my Wednesday class. It's in the Unit 2 course content folder all the way at the bottom of the page. And I made this giant graphic that sits right above the exam to just give you like a little visual warning or reminder about some things about the exam. So those things what were those things? Let me just look at it real fast. Okay, so first of all, don't open the exam until you're ready to complete it. If you're in my hybrid class, you've already taken online exams before, so you should know exactly how the system works. But you can only open the exam once. Once you open it, it's registered in the Blackboard system, and you have to finish it in that one setting. So you can't open the exam, look at the questions, and close the exam and come back to it later, okay? So don't open it until you are ready to actually go. Oh, sorry, let me put my phone on silent here. Next up, the exam has a timer on it. So for my hybrid classes, the timer is set to 90 minutes, just like the first exam. For my Wednesday class, because this is a midterm and it's longer, you have a timer of 2 hours, okay? Now in both classes, both settings, the timer will be there and it will warn you, it will click down, it'll say like you've used half your time, you have 15 minutes left, you have 5 minutes left, you have 1 minute left, you have 30 seconds left, and it'll count down like a little bomb clock, there we go. But you can go beyond the timer, okay? When it reaches time, a little window will pop up and it will say, you've reached the time limit. Do you want to submit or do you want to go back to the exam? Click the button for going back to the exam if you still need more time to work on it, okay? So if you need a couple extra minutes, that's fine. However, I would not expect to see the exam open for like 3 hours or 4 hours or 5 hours. It shouldn't take that long. If it's taking that long, that might mean that some outside sources are being consulted, which we don't want, okay? So the timer is there, but you can go a little bit beyond it. Don't stress and rush through things just to submit before that happens. Next up, don't use any books, don't use any notes, don't use other internet sites as you are taking the exam. So any answer that I can see that's been copied from one of those other resources will automatically receive 0 points, okay? And it's pretty clear to me, it's pretty obvious when things have been copied from other sources. It's not something that I expect to run into. Usually what happens when people do copy something from somewhere else, it's really because the person's not feeling confident about their own knowledge on the subject. But even if it's something like, oh, wait, I can't quite remember what that word means, or I can't quite think of what the best way to say it is, right? Let's say there's a question about bipedalism, and you're like, but I just wish that I could get like just the right words to describe bipedalism so that I can get all the points. Well, what's the harm in just going over to Wikipedia and just quickly getting, the definition there just to make sure that it's right? Like, I know what it means, but I just want to make sure that it's right. And then I put that in the exam. Don't do it. okay? Do not do it. Again, it really stands out, like it's obvious when answers have been copied from somewhere else. And it's also super easy for me to find, okay? Anything you can find on the internet, I can find on the internet. So it's way better to just leave your answers up to your own brain. And to do that, that means you have to, be putting in the time in advance so that you feel confident and you don't feel that sort of lure or pull to use outside resources, okay? I don't want to know what Wikipedia has to say about the subject. I want to know what you have to say about the subject, all right? Okay, so don't use any outside sources and read all of the instructions. This is going to be really important for this exam because in both my hybrid classes and my Wednesday class, for the short answer questions, there's short answer questions on both versions of the exam. And they're not identical exams, but on both exams, there are a number of short answer questions that are options, okay? So let's say, I'm just picking a number. Let's say that there are 6 short answer questions that are in the exam. You are only going to be asked to respond to 3 of those questions. Okay, so you basically read through all of the questions and then pick the best 3 for you. So maybe there's a question on there that you're like, oh crap, like I knew I was supposed to study that and I completely forgot, or it's something that I don't feel as strong about. That's cool. Pick another question that you do feel stronger about. Okay, so when it comes to the short answer questions, and I put big red instructions in there, just make sure you're reading carefully because you have an option about which questions you answer, all right? And there's extra credit built into the exam. So, it's a big exam and it's not an easy exam, but it's the exam that we're taking. So anyway, that's my spiel. And yeah, now I'm ready to get started on this. Okay, so whenever you have questions, just go ahead and type them into the little, chat thingy, and I will get to answering them, right? Tell you what, I'm going to start us off and just add something in here. All right. It's good. I think we should be ready to go. Get some hand lotion going because with washing my hands like 97 times a day, skin's getting all dry. All right. I see we've got a couple people online here. So don't be shy, don't be timid. If you have a question about something, I guarantee you other people have the exact same question. So whatever you want to talk about, I'm here. Again, I'm not sick. Here we go. Okay. Yeah, so I'm sitting here silently just because there's no questions yet, but I'm just going back into the exam and just checking it again to see how many questions of each type, because I forgot to write that down earlier. So just figured it out for one section. I got to look at the other one, and then I will be able to update that information on Blackboard. Let's see. But as soon as you have a question, just type it in and I'll answer it. Okay. All right. Well, for whoever is watching this, if you are in my Tuesday hybrid classes, then your exam has a total of 30 questions. So most of those are multiple choice. There's 20 multiple choice questions. There's 3 short answer questions. There's 4 like fill in the blank questions, and then 3 extra credit. Okay, so 30 questions total. 20 of them are multiple choice. If you're in my Wednesday class taking your midterm, your exam has a total of 36 questions. 24 of them are multiple choice. 3 of them are short answer, And then you've got like 6 sort of fill in the blanky ones and 3 extra credit. Okay. So yeah, that's how many questions that breaks down to for each class. 30 for my hybrids, 36 for my Wednesday class. Now let me just make sure that I'm not missing any questions. Nope, not missing any questions. We're just nice and quiet tonight. Let me see. I don't know about you guys. I am a big, or at least I try to be a big, like, list keeper. I've got my to-do list of things every day. What have I actually gotten done today? Ugh. Oh, there's still so many things. Still so many things. Let's see. I have another monitor over here. That's why I'm trying looking this way. All right, I know there's people online. I can see you existing. Let's see, what else can I do? Look at my census information. We all have to fill out the census this year, right? It's very important. It helps the government know where to allocate resources. Okay. So what do I do? Log in online. Okay. So this is my 2020 census. You see what happens when you ask questions? I do my paperwork. What do you mean it can't be found? Fine. Oops. I guess you should spell your last name correctly on the census, huh? Household questions. Okay. Do I have any children, such as newborn babies or nieces or nephews, living in my house? No. In addition. Okay. House rented to be rented. Okay. Who will rent the house? Us. Okay. So I'm filling out the census right now, and it's asking about my race. This is interesting. Okay. So it just asked me about my Hispanic origin. Let me go back to that. It says, is Sheila Nightingale of Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish origin? And the options are no, or yes, Mexican, Mexican American, Chicano, yes, Puerto Rican, yes, Cuban, yes, another Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish origin. For example, Salvadoran, Dominican, Colombian, Guatemalan, Spaniard, Ecuadorian. Okay, so I got that one. Now on this next page, it says, what is Sheila Nightingale's race? And the options are white, Black or African American, American Indian or Alaska Native, and then Chinese, Filipino, Asian Indian, Vietnamese, Korean, Japanese, other Asian, Native Hawaiian, Samoan, Chamorro, other Pacific Islander, or some other race. But it says up at the top, for the census, Hispanic origins are not races. Interesting. You know, the history of the census is, and like how those race categories change over time is really interesting. I think I've mentioned this in at least one of my classes this spring, that like when the census first started in 1790, I think there were like two categories. It was like, or three, I guess, white, black, and other. But then people who were Hispanic, and specifically people of Mexican origin, for a number of years, like many, many decades, would kind of like go back and forth between, sometimes they were considered white on the census, and sometimes they were considered other, and sometimes they had a category called Hispanic, and then other times they would be put back in the white category. So like these racial categories that are used in the census, that's also one of the ways that we kind of see that race is this this invented social construct. Like it's something that humans have made up, because our definitions of race also change over time according to what people think is important, right? So like a lot of these, you know, and I think now you can put, yeah, it says select one or more boxes. You used to not be able to do that just like 20 years ago for the US Census. You had to pick one thing, and that was it. That's all you could be. It was just one thing. But there's a lot of people who aren't just one thing, right? And so these racial categories, and I'm using like air quotes around race this whole time, they really highlight how much of a social and cultural creation race is, rather than something that's biological, right? Which is what we talked about at the beginning of the semester, about how race is not biologically true, because we're so much more similar than we are different, and there's not a single physical characteristic that can be used to draw lines between groups of people. Like if a race is similar to a species or a subspecies of another animal, then there's the way that subspecies are typically defined in other animals would be groups of animals who share physical characteristics because they are closely related, right? So if you have like breeds of horses or breeds of dogs, right? A basset hound looks like a basset hound, and all basset hounds have the same characteristics because they all share this like basset hound ancestor. And so there are certain basset hound traits that you don't expect to see in other dogs because those other dogs have their own ancestry, and so they have their own characteristics. But if that were true of humans, then there would be characteristics that you only see in some humans because they all share that ancestry, and then you wouldn't be able to find those traits in any other groups. But that's not really how physical characteristics work. It's certainly not how things like skin color works. Because our skin color, yeah, it's related to our ancestry. Like the color of our parents' skin is a big influence, obviously, on the color of our skin. But just because someone has my same color of skin doesn't mean that they have the same ancestry that I do. Doesn't mean that their ancestors are from the same part of the world, because we know that local environment influences our physical characteristics so much that you have, this gradient of skin tones where you have lighter tones at the poles where the UV intensity is not so extreme. It's a lot cloudier, it's colder. And then around the equator, you have more melanin enriched skin because UV radiation, solar radiation, is more intense and more direct. And so those populations have melanin enriched skin because melanin is a natural sunblock, right? And it helps protect the body from the damaging parts of overexposure to UV. But that doesn't mean that everyone who has the same skin tone is related to each other. They just happen to share a similar adaptation because they all live, around the equator or near the poles. So yeah, that's kind of interesting because that's one of the topics, that my Wednesday class could be asked about on the midterm exam. Since your midterm exam covers everything from the beginning of the semester, it covers that early discussion of the topic of race. So it's kind of perfect, actually, that I'm filling out the census right now and looking at all these racial categories and how they're defined. Okay, I see a question just came in. So I will put the census on hold for you beautiful people. Okay, this says, hi, Professor, can you please talk a little bit about hominin evolution and 2 million years ago? Excellent. Yes, I can. All right, let me put my notes and stuff away and get out my little whiteboard. Okay. So we remember that if we're talking about hominin evolution, that hominins, of which we are the only ones who are still alive today, hominins have been evolving for about 7 million years, maybe a little bit more, a little bit less, but we say 7 million as a good round ballpark number, right? And of course we have, I'm going to do this, which I know you're all sick of and bored of, but I'm just going to recreate this little cladogram that we've seen a million times before. Remember, when we draw these diagrams, this is a way of representing the evolutionary relationships of different groups of animals or different groups of plants. So we could put any number of different, we could put different species on here. It doesn't have to just be hominins. But the way that the lines connect together, they show us how we believe these groups to be related by ancestors in the past. So we're going to start with us over on the left, the humans. Then we've got the bonobos, the chimps, the gorillas, the orangutans, and the gibbons, right? The hominins, again, that means us. We are the only living hominin in the world today. However, all this stuff that came before us, they were hominins as well. So if I wanted to circle the part of this diagram that represents the hominins, I'd circle this whole thing right here, back to our split with chimpanzees, right? So we shared some ancestor in the past with chimpanzees. This represents a period of time where there's no humans, no chimps, no bonobos. There's something else. That something else might be Sahelanthropus chadensis, which I think I already told you. I'm not going to ask you to write that down on the exam because that's cruel and unusual punishment to have to write out that whole name, Sahelanthropus chadensis. However, if you see it on the exam, I would hope you know who we're talking about. Okay, so we're just going to call that guy Chad for now, although it actually begins with a T. Okay. Chad, we think, is our ancestor that lived about 7 million years ago. Then that group split into two. Half of that group went on to become the chimps and the bonobos, and then half went on to become us, right? So changing, adapting to their environment, changing over time, just a little bit each generation. But when you have millions and millions of generations, or a million generations, then you get to some pretty big changes. All right, now I'm going to erase this so that we can zoom in a little bit on the hominin line. Okay, so now let's imagine that we have, let's see, yeah, I'm just going to go like this so that we can still have the bonobos and the chimps represented there, and then we have the humans, okay? Here is Sahelanthropus chadensis down here at the bottom. That's 7 million years ago. So now, those two lectures of early hominin evolution and the genus Homo, those two lectures are about what happens in this distance. And it turns out it's a lot, right? There's probably like at least 20 different species of hominin that's existed in the past 7 million years. If you remember from the second homework assignment, Louise Leakey says there have been at least 16 hominid or upright walking apes, right, of which we are one. But that video was made a while ago, and there have been new discoveries since that time. So, you know, the more time goes on, we might be discovering more and more of our hominin ancestors or hominin, you know, great aunts and uncles that we have to sort of fit into this story. Okay, so now let's think about those 4 major characteristics that are discussed at the beginning of the early hominin evolution lecture. The 4 characteristics that we use to understand hominin evolution and what's happened over the last 7 million years. So those are bipedalism, which means upright walking on 2 legs, encephalization, which is an increase in brain size. We have the use of tools, and then we also have changes in tooth morphology, meaning changes in the shape and the size of our teeth and our ancestors' teeth. So as we think about what's happened in the last 7 million years, we want to kind of plot those, or at least where we can, plot some of those milestones onto our diagram, okay? So what's the first thing that like really sets us apart from the other apes? What's the thing that makes us different as hominins from our great ape relatives? It's going to be the fact that we walk upright on 2 legs, right? We are bipedal. And not only that, we are obligate bipeds, meaning that we have to walk upright on 2 legs. So chimps and bonobos and gorillas and orangutans and gibbons, they can walk upright. And they have that sort of, you know, side-to-side shuffle that apes do. We don't have that side-to-side shuffle because we've spent a long time evolving to be these nice, graceful, upright walkers. So bipedalism is really the thing that separates us from the rest of the hominins, especially at this early time period. So that's going to be like the first thing that comes into our line here. Bipedalism. And we have hominin ancestors that are certainly walking upright by, you know, 5-6 million years ago. Maybe not exactly the way that we do today, not as elegantly as we do today. And if you go back to the lecture video and look at, for example, the images of like the Ardipithecus species, Ardipithecus, what is it? Ardipithecus ramidus. There's like representation of most of the skeleton, but if you look at our big toe lines up. So that means that although there were adaptations to walking upright as early as Ardipithecus ramidus, which is maybe 6 million years old, they still had some more like primitive apey characteristics, and that included that toe on the back foot that acted like a thumb. So we're still spending time in trees, most likely, you know, for survival and protection from predators, especially at night. But bipedalism comes in early. Now, the next really important thing, I shouldn't say next, the other really important thing that we see that distinguishes us from the rest of the apes is we have these giant heads, right? Giant brains, big, big egg heads. Like we think we look normal, but compared to everyone else, like they look at us and just go, what's wrong with those guys? Because our brains are so just expanded and large. That increase in brain size over time is called encephalization. And we see a little bit of an increase in brain size in these earlier periods of time. But for a long while, most hominins still had relatively small brains, less than 500 cubic centimeters, which isn't that much bigger than the brain of a chimpanzee. So we're talking about upright, small-brained apes running around, East Africa, still being pretty apey, except they're on two legs. We see this big encephalization push around 2 million years ago. So Amagiri, that might be sort of what you're referencing in your question about 2 million years ago. We see encephalization happening there, and particularly once we see the Homo species showing up on the scene. So in this earlier time period, we've got Aurora tugenensis, we've got Ardipithecus cadaba and Ardipithecus ramidus. Then we get into the Australopithecus group, exists along this line. We've got the Paranthropus group that exists, Homo habilis, then Homo rudolfensis, not sure where that one fits in, but then the big one, the important one, Homo ergaster, showing up around 1.8 million years ago in East Africa. Homo ergaster is also called Homo erectus. It was first called Homo erectus based on fossils found in China in the early 1920s, and that was one of the earliest hominin fossils discovered. And so that led people to believe, or at least some people to believe, that maybe hominin evolution had happened in Asia. So you have this Asian Homo erectus, then a few decades later, they find Homo ergaster in Africa. And so then people are like, well, how do we explain this? If we've got Homo ergaster in Africa and Homo erectus in Asia, and they're probably the same species, how do we have the same species in these two different places? Well, the only way to explain it is a migration, right? So here's where we kind of tie it back in here, because it's really, Homo ergaster is just a cool species. Homo ergaster shows up a little less than 2 million years ago in Africa. And they've got really big brains, about 1,000 cubic centimeters. And just to give you a point of comparison, our brains are about 1,350 cubic centimeters. Chimpanzees have brains that are like 400 cubic centimeters or less. So they're much closer to us. Homo ergaster, so we have this big encephalises. Let me just, Homo ergaster. This is the group that migrates outside of the African continent for the very first time. This is the out of Africa migration. And now I'm going to drop my whiteboard and bring out my hominin family tree, right? This is in the Unit 2 course content folder. If you don't have it already, pull it up on your computer. You can type into these boxes. This species right here is Homo ergaster. And this is a species that then spreads out into Asia and into Europe. And then you can write the name out of Africa 1 in this box right there. Okay. And you'll notice it's the first species that comes up in Africa and then spreads out into the rest of the world. So it's a super important one. Once that species spreads into Africa, spreads from Africa into Europe and Asia, then in each of those places, it continues evolving. And we see it evolving into different hominin species in each place. So in Asia, we see Homo ergaster ending up becoming this like sort of classic Homo erectus, like the ones that were discovered in China. It has some slightly different characteristics than the African examples, but it still looks like basically the same species. But then you also have in Indonesia, it looks like Homo erectus kind of getting stuck on some of the smaller islands in Indonesia and the Philippines, and then going through this sort of rapid evolution on these small islands because their gene pool is cut off from the rest of the Homo erectus gene pool. This is an example of random genetic drift, where a big gene pool suddenly becomes very small. And so when there's a severe reduction in the gene pool, then evolution doesn't necessarily go just according to natural selection, where the best traits are selected for. Instead, you only have that small population to work with. And so what often happens is that bigger species get small and small species get big. So in Indonesia, you have the bigger Homo erectus stuck on this little island, and then they become super, super tiny. And that super tiny little Indonesian fossil, as you know, is Homo floresiensis, or the hobbit, which lived until probably around 50,000 years ago. Again, in that homework video, Louise Leakey says that they lived until about 18,000 years ago. Those were early dates. So when the site was first discovered and those fossils were first discovered just 15 years ago or so, it looked like those fossils were really young. But now they've done some redating and it looks like they're maybe 50,000 years old. But still, 50,000 years ago, for this teeny tiny little dwarf hominin to be running around Indonesia while our species is spreading all over Africa and into the rest of the world as well, that's kind of wild to think that we've shared this planet with other species longer than we haven't shared this planet with other hominin species. And then there's like a new species perhaps in the Philippines, Homo luzonensis. Then we've got Homo erectus in Europe, which we see goes through different branching and evolutionary stages, going to Homo antecessor. And then there's Homo heidelbergensis, and then there's Homo neanderthalensis. Also then around, in Siberia, in the Himalaya mountains, you have the Denisovans showing up. Listen, this is a lot of detail that you're not going to necessarily need to know for the exam. Like, I'm not going to ask you the specifics of when was Homo antecessor alive and, what is the current debate on Homo antecessor versus Homo heidelbergensis. That's too much detail. But I want you to know a little bit about Homo erectus and that they spread out in this out of Africa 1 migration pretty much as soon as they show up in Africa, 1.8 million years ago, and they start to spread. And then, of course, in Africa, there was still Homo ergaster there after some of them departed and moved into Europe and Asia. The ones that were still in Africa kept evolving until they eventually became us, right? And so around 315,000 years ago, we see the first fossils of our species, Homo sapiens, in Africa, in Morocco specifically, but probably they were a bit more widespread. And then some time passes. Our species is like chilling in Africa and doing some really cool things in different places. So like when our species shows up in Africa, and when I say show up, but I mean, of course, they evolved. They emerged from pre-existing groups. It's not just like poof, one day they just showed up out of nowhere. But around the African continent, Homo sapiens groups were doing different things in different places. They had different types of technologies throughout the African continent. And it looks like they were really adaptable. They were really responsive to their environments and also probably their social systems. So we have this they were like us, extremely variable physically, extremely variable behaviorally. And then maybe around 70,000 years ago or so, some of those humans start to migrate outside of the African continent as well. And this is out of Africa too. And so we have Homo sapiens moving into Europe, moving throughout Asia, and then all the way down into Australia. And when those humans encountered the hominins who were already in that area, when they encountered Neanderthals in Europe and the Denisovans in Siberia, they had babies with them. They mixed their genes, right? So you have two very similar hominin groups coming together. Well, I don't want to overstate it. You have individuals of two different groups at least occasionally coming together and mixing their genes, and then the offspring being incorporated into the human group. So it's not like humans and Neanderthals just said, hey, let's form one giant supergroup. What we're really talking about is every once in a while, a human female would get pregnant by a Neanderthal male, and then her offspring would grow up in her group, right? And the Neanderthal male would presumably be off doing his own thing with his Neanderthal people. And the same for Denisovans. We know this happened because we can see the evidence of that outside DNA in our own genomes today. In our own DNA today, we can see the Neanderthal parts. We can see the Denisovan parts. All right, I just talked for a whole long time around kind of a brief prompt. So I hope that somewhat addressed what you wanted it to. If there was actually a more specific question that I just talked my way all around and I didn't get to your point, please tell me so that I can answer your real question. As you can probably tell, I enjoy talking about this stuff because we've had just this remarkable history, the ways that we've evolved, and the way that we, the fact that we're even here is kind of a miracle at a certain level. Like, all of these things had to happen for us to be where we are. If our ancestors never became bipedal, if our ancestors never started using stone tools, if our ancestors never started using fire, we wouldn't be in the same position that we are today, right? So it's been a really cool 7 million years. Okay, let me just refresh my phone to make sure that I'm not missing something here. No, I think I'm good. Maybe I'm going to retitle this this video like "Professor Rambles for 30 Minutes about just anything that crosses her mind." Maybe I should get back to my... Okay, good. I'm glad. So the comment just came in. Thank you. I understand the concept now. Yeah, I mean, think about those big events, those big patterns. Bipedalism, why is it important? What did it let our ancestors do? It meant that we could probably protect ourselves from predators because we could see them coming. We could carry things like food or tools or babies. Some think that it helped us sort of keep our bodies cool, like standing up keeps you cooler than if you're down on all fours and the sun's hitting you on your back. What does encephalization thinking? We can be more creative, and we can do this thing called culture, right? Homo Ergaster, Homo erectus, that stuff is important. Yeah, I would say think in general, bigger trends. And yeah, use the study guide because that also, that'll help pick out the important stuff. Okay. We still got a couple more minutes though, that I'm happy to talk if someone has another question. Well, this is interesting. Sorry, I just looked back at the census and I checked the box for me, but then I have enter, for example, German, Irish, English, Italian, Lebanese, Egyptian, etc. It's interesting. All right. English. Region. Okay. Take a picture of this. It's very interesting. I'm wondering if I've ever filled out a census before. This does not look familiar at all. Okay. All right, what else? What else do we need to talk about? Let's see. I would say for everyone, but especially for my Wednesday class, since this is a midterm from the beginning of the semester, don't forget the stuff from early on. Just because the most recent stuff is the human evolution stuff, don't neglect that stuff from before. That's just as important. And also, everyone, remember that forensic anthropology is also included on this exam. Okay, that lecture, it's there on Blackboard, so don't neglect it. There's definitely some questions, and some questions with some pictures on forensic anthropology on the exam, okay? All right, I see another question. Did anthropologists find some important fossils in the west of Africa? Because I'm kind of jealous of all the fossils we studied in class from the east and the south. That is such a good question. Such a good question. So what, just to catch everyone else up, right? Amagera is pointing out the fact that all of the discoveries that we've talked about are from, and there's some fossils like in Egypt and stuff like that. I have to imagine that there's stuff in West Africa. I have to imagine. You know, I'm an archaeologist, so I don't study the fossils, but I study early stone tool technologies. And it's really just been within the past couple of years, maybe the past 10 years, if I'm being a little bit generous, that more people have been working in West Africa. And that's, you know, for a number of reasons. Like, yeah, West Africa has, you know, between like some political stuff and then some environmental stuff, I think that there hasn't always been access to West Africa the same way that there's been access to East Africa, right? Because East Africa and South Africa were under like British colonial rule, or the Dutch in South Africa. And so there was a lot, it was really tied into the institutional, you know, scientific systems that were existing in England. So it was like people in England were interested in these, you know, questions of where do humans come from, and it was easy enough for them to be working in the territory. Reason to play and why some parts of Africa have been more explored than others. But as I mentioned, some people are starting to work more now in West Africa to look for some of that older material. There's not at this moment a strong record for really early stuff for preserving fossils, because they, you know, the roots and all those plants, they just break bones down before they have a chance to fossilize. That's why we don't really have gorilla fossils either. As far as I know, there's only like one set of gorilla fossils that are about 10 million years old, and it's just a couple of teeth. And there's one set of chimpanzee fossils, and they're only 500,000 years old, and it's a couple of teeth. So it's only the parts of the body that are the hardest, which is the teeth, because they're covered in enamel. But there's so few of them, and it's just because apes live in forested environments. And so the same with our early ancestors, they were still living in these like oftentimes very, you know, dense woodland environments. They just don't preserve fossils. So there's a lot of sort of reasons why, you know, a biased history of exploration, and then also just a bias of what gets preserved, that's influenced why things are showing up or we're noticing them one place rather than another. But listen, West Africa, I think, is going to be really interesting once we know more about what's going on there. Certainly in terms of the archaeology of humans, of our species, West Africa looks really different than East Africa and South Africa. West Africa has, you see stone tool traditions that are lasting for a really long time in West Africa, which is interesting to me because the area that I work in, that's sort of between East Africa and South Africa and Malawi, it also has some very late persisting stone tool technologies. So like people were kind of doing things in the old way for a really long time. And you see that in West Africa as well. So, you know, it's just the more research that's done, the more cool this story is going to look. And West Africa is going to be a really important part of that. And it's an important part of really characterizing and explaining what makes humans unique and successful, and explaining sort of that diversity. So yeah, I get why you're jealous. Give it time. Give it time. The West African stuff, I hope, will come. Yeah. Okay. Anything else? We're hitting right about 7 now. I know we still have a couple people online. And so if you do have a question, just go ahead and plop it in there. Otherwise, it's okay if we don't have more questions for now. These questions have been great, and they've given me a chance to ramble on for a very long time. We will be back in a couple different formats over the next few days. So tomorrow are the online office hours. That's through Blackboard Collaborate Ultra. A bunch of you joined that last week. If you have not yet tried Collaborate Ultra, tomorrow is your chance. We will be running office hours from 1 to 2 p.m. tomorrow, and then also 5 to 6 p.m. So that roughly lines up with the time that I have my hybrid classes on Tuesdays. But no matter which class of mine you're in, whether you're in one of my Tuesday classes or you're in my Wednesday class, you are welcome to show up on Collaborate Ultra. Essentially what I have is like 3 windows open so that I can be talking to anyone from any one of my classes, okay? So that's going to be tomorrow. Wednesday is another Collaborate Ultra session from 2 to 3. Then I think we're going to take Thursday off. But then Friday night, I figured that most people are going to take the exam over the weekend. So Friday night, I thought I'd do a big review session here on YouTube. And that'll be from 7 to 9 on Friday, okay? So for anyone who's watching this, if you know that you can't be online when one of these reviews is happening, but you want to make sure that you get your question answered, you can always email me and just say, hey, professor, would you mind including this in your review or whatever, and we'll get your questions answered, okay? All right, well then I am going to leave it there. Thank you very much to my major contributor in the questions today. They're really good questions, and hopefully some other people find this video useful as well, people who are watching now or who watch after the fact. And yeah, that's it. So have a good night, and I will see you tomorrow. Okay, bye guys. Almost bye. Okay, bye for real.